June 1941, German troops crossed the border of the USSR. The most terrible war in the history of the country begins. Soviet cities are bombed, soldiers die, equipment burns. And now the main question: why was it a surprise? After all, Stalin was warned about it in advance. In the months before the attack, the USSR received dozens of alarm signals. Intelligence officers, foreign diplomats, even allies, all said one thing: Hitler is preparing for war. But Stalin waved it off. Why? He did not believe? Or was it profitable for him to pretend that he did not believe? In May 1941, the Soviet intelligence officer Richard Sorge, working in Japan, transmitted to Moscow the exact date of the attack, June 22nd. This was not a rumor or conjecture, but information from high-ranking sources in the German embassy. However, the Kremlin paid no attention to this report. Why? It's simple. Stalin considered Sorge an adventurer. In Moscow, his reports were often perceived as exaggerated and unreliable. As a result, the report went unheeded, and a month later, Germany attacked the USSR on the very day about which Sorge had warned. Even earlier, in April 1941, the USSR received an alarming signal from Great Britain. British intelligence, MI6, passed on the information. Hitler was going to attack, and it would happen in the summer. But Stalin's reaction was sharply negative. He decided that the British just want to quarrel the USSR and Germany. After all, there was no trust between London and Moscow. Not long ago, Stalin had concluded a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and Britain was at war against Germany. Therefore, any warning from London seemed suspicious. It turns out that Stalin was warned from all sides, but he did not believe anyone. Stalin feared panic more than war. He did not want to put the country on alert in advance, so as not to provoke chaos among the population and the military. Perhaps he thought he could negotiate with Hitler at the last moment. Soviet intelligence was working too well and too much. So many different reports were flowing into Moscow, from false rumors to real facts, that Stalin simply drowned in the flood. He decided that the reports of the attack were just as much rumors as hundreds of others. But perhaps he knew something after all. August 1939. Moscow. In the Kremlin, they sign a document that shocked the whole world, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was an agreement between the USSR and Nazi Germany. The parties promised not to attack each other. And in the secret protocols, they divided Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin was sure this treaty would give the USSR time to prepare for a possible war. But in the end, everything ended in disaster. For 2 years after the signing of the pact, Germany managed to occupy Poland, attack France, bomb England. Meanwhile, the USSR supplied the Germans with resources, grain, oil, metals. The Kremlin thought that it would be unprofitable for Hitler to attack while supplies were being delivered. But everything changed in June 1941. On the night before the invasion, German planes were already flying into Soviet airspace, and Stalin still gave the order: do not give in to provocations. The Red Army did not open fire for fear that it would spoil relations with Germany. As a result, the enemy gained a huge advantage in the first hours of the war. A few days before the attack, German diplomats suddenly left Moscow. This was a clear sign because before the war with Poland and France, Hitler had done the same thing. But the Soviet leadership decided not to panic. Why? Stalin did not want to believe that Hitler had betrayed him. Until the last moment, he thought that the Germans were just scaring or wanted to extract more concessions from the USSR. Stalin trapped himself in a trust trap. He believed that Hitler would honor the treaty because it was beneficial to himself. But Hitler did not play by the rules. The USSR could have avoided disaster if it had believed the obvious in time. All the signs of an attack were on the surface, but the fear of making a mistake paralyzed Stalin. He was afraid to provoke a conflict, but in the end he himself ended up in the role of a victim. There is one oddity. A few months before the German attack on the USSR, the Red Army itself pulled troops to the border. And the official version was that it was just a drill. But if the USSR was not going to attack, why was it necessary to move the armies forward? And if it was going to attack, why didn't it strike first? Some historians are sure that Stalin had a secret plan for a preemptive strike against Germany, but Hitler was faster. In the summer of 1941, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were transferred to the western frontiers. Tank divisions, artillery, and aviation were all concentrated on the border. But there was a problem. They were not prepared for defense. Bunkers and fortifications were not built, but the army was deployed as if preparing for an offensive. When the Germans struck, the Soviet units were trapped. In the first weeks of the war, the Red Army lost up to 75% of its aircraft and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Some historians believe that the USSR had a plan called Thunder, an offensive operation against Germany. The meaning was as follows: not to wait for a blow from Hitler, but to attack first and transfer the war to the territory of the enemy. But the plan either did not have time to realize, or Stalin, until the last, dared not give the order. As a result, the German offensive caught the Red Army in the worst position. If the USSR had struck first, perhaps there would not have been the catastrophe of 1941. But then the Soviet Union would have looked like the aggressor, not the victim. So did Stalin know about the attack? Or was he just waiting for the opportune moment to strike first? By the start of the war, the USSR had more than 10,000 combat aircraft. But in the first 24 hours, the Germans destroyed about 1,200 machines, many of them right on the airfields. The planes stood in open rows, as if on parade. They had no time to disperse, camouflage, or at least disperse them to reserve bases. The pilots were not allowed to take to the air without orders. When the order did come, it was too late. The airfields were on fire, communication was lost, and German fighters already controlled the sky. The result: Germany gained complete air supremacy from the first hours of the war. But aviation was only part of the problem. On the ground, it was even worse. In the first hours of the war, Soviet border guards and soldiers could not shoot at the Germans, even when they had already crossed the border. The High Command did not believe in an attack to the last and was afraid of provoking Hitler. The order to fight came too late, a few hours after the attack began, when many units had already been defeated. As a result, entire divisions fell into encirclement and surrendered as prisoners. In the first days of the war alone, the Germans took more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers. The Red Army was not even ready for defense because it was forced to not give in to provocations until the last day. If the troops had opened fire immediately, the losses could have been less. Germany won not only by force, but also by surprise. If the USSR had been put on alert at least 24 hours before the attack, the history of 1941 could have turned out differently. But why Stalin did not give the order to prepare for defense, even when the threat became obvious? June 22, 1941, at 12 o'clock. Moscow time at 12 o'clock on the radio. The People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs Molotov speaks. It is he who announces to the country that war has begun. But where was Stalin at that moment? After the German attack, he disappeared from public space for several days. From June 22nd to June 29th, he did not appear on the radio, did not make an address. This gave rise to many rumors. Some historians believe that Stalin went into shock. He did not expect such a blow and a few days did not know what to do. According to another version, he was going to test the reaction of his associates to make sure that his power remains unshaken. The fact remains that he addressed the nation only on July 3rd, almost 2 weeks after the outbreak of war. In 1945, when the USSR had already defeated Germany, Stalin categorically forbade discussion of the theory that he knew of the attack in advance. Any hints of Soviet leadership mistakes at the beginning of the war were suppressed. History textbooks began to write that the attack was insidious and unexpected, and versions that intelligence warned Stalin in advance simply not considered. Stalin realized that the beginning of the war was his biggest failure. He did not want anyone to discuss after the victory that the mistakes of 1941 cost millions of people their lives. Stalin's disappearance in the early days of the war shows that he was not sure of his plan. If he really had a well-thought-out response to an attack, he would have acted immediately. There is still no definitive answer as to whether Stalin knew of the attack or simply didn't believe the intelligence. He may have had a plan that did not have time to materialize. The story of June 22, 1941, remains one of the most mysterious pages in the past of the USSR. Do you think Stalin knew about the attack, or was he really caught off guard? Write in the comments.